Hey guys, I want to do a follow-up video on the Plumbus video that I made. I want to go into a little bit more of a deeper process of how I made this. Some things that I learned, some mistakes that I made. Because, God, casting silicone out of a 3D printed part is actually really fun. It really opens up the opportunities that you can make with a 3D printer besides 3D printing figurines out of PLA directly. Because I made this whole thing just on my Prusa Mark III in a silicone kit just that I got from the store. And I think this is a pretty accurate model of the Plumbus that's in Rick and Morty. This was a super fun thing to make, and I'll show you how I made it. First thing I did was make this in Fusion 360. This was a lot easier to make than I thought it would be. The geometry is pretty simple. This took me all about like an hour to make. You're watching the replay that Fusion has. But yeah, the simple geometry is pretty easy to make. I made this dingus end straight because I thought this was going to be soft enough for it to droop on its own, but it's actually a little bit harder than I thought. But that's okay. Something to do for next time. After I got the model made, I created a shell. Basically, the Fusion will create an external shell. So you create an extrusion from your part with a cavity on the inside and the exact shape of the model that you made. You're just doing this simple shell command gives you your mold. It's pretty straightforward. And once you have that mold, then you just have to cut it up in what you think is the best way to print it on your printer. So I cut it up in a way so all of the parts that the silicone is going to touch are facing up on my printer. Because anything on a top surface of a printer generally leaves the best surface quality. As you can see, the stuff on the bottom kind of looks awful, but the stuff on top looks great. So I cut it up in such a way where it would A, fit on my printer, and B, leave me with somewhat of a decent surface finish. Then once I had the mold cut up, I just exported the STLs to the Prusa slicer and then just cut away, then just printed away. They took me about 12 hours to print, 6 hours for each side. Then it came to just taking the parts off a printer just like you would anything else, removing the supports, cleaning it up. I hit the top parts, so where the surface retractions are, or where the retractions are, they tend to leave a little bit of a bump because right off the printer these aren't perfectly flat. So I just hit it on a piece of sandpaper to knock off all the edges. And it came out great. The parts really lined up a lot better than I thought they would. Then it came to putting the mold together. This part sucked. I didn't have the right epoxy that I really like using. This stuff, I didn't have this on hand, so I tried using some of the other things I had laying around. I had the JB World Clear, didn't work. I tried super glue, didn't work. I tried this stuff. It's kind of like that putty that you cut and work with your fingers, and it turns hard. Did not work. Hot glue ended up being too rubbery, and you want a really strong mold, so hot glue didn't work. So this part sucked. The other thing I had trouble with was lining this part of the mold up. Yeah, this way, because I wanted the parts to be perfectly flat and flush, but if I lined them up this way, I couldn't see if I was lined up underneath, and if I tried to make sure I was lined up underneath, I couldn't make sure the sides were flush. So I should just cut a hole in a piece of MDF and use that to to clamp the plastic to, and then I could flip it over and then make sure I was good on the other side. That ended up working great. And after struggling with the wrong epoxy, I ended up biting the bullet and running down to Home Depot and buying what I really needed. What I should have done in the first place. I spent way too much time screwing around with stuff that didn't work and knowing that this is what I needed. So the molds actually glue together. I then came in afterwards with another epoxy. It's called XTC. I think I have it here. Yeah. I came in with another epoxy called XTC 3D. It's a 2-part epoxy. It's got the consistency of like maple syrup. And you brush that onto your part, and it hides all of the layer lines left by the 3D printer. I was left with a pretty glassy, pretty smooth finish, which is what you want. I ended up doing, I think, 2 or 3 coats. The trick is if you go too thin, it doesn't wet out and get smooth. If you go too thick, the part will pull, or the epoxy will pull, and you get flats, and you also don't want that. So, you know, kind of finding that balance, and then on your brush, some of the bristles fall off, so you just got to make sure you fish those out. I prefer using a brush over the foam, but yeah, that's neither here nor there. So yeah, then it came time to start laying silicone. So I've already poured the silicone here. You do it in 50-50 parts. Then you just add a little bit of dye. A little bit of pigment goes a very long way. Happen to have a flesh dye, so got that ready to go. Turns out I actually did use mold release on this part. I don't think I used enough because these parts sucked to get out of the mold. I'll explain later. Probably should do this in a ventilated area for reasons you'll see in a second. Ugh, it's those awful reasons. Then it came to mixing the epoxy. It came to mixing the silicone. Yeah, you just mix it up, pour it in a second glass. That way you don't have any contaminants or parts that you didn't mix up in your first glass. Then it just came to painting it on. You want to paint on the first layer of anything if you can. That way you don't get, you get all of the parts. You don't get any voids or bubbles or anything. It's a safe bet to do that. So I did this in 2 parts. I painted on the flesh part, let that cure. Then I painted on the red part, which was just a mix of red and blue dye. So I did 2 coats of this. First coat seemed to come out thin. There were some thin parts where I really didn't like, so I hit it with a second coat. Let that cure, and I think that was good enough. If I were to do this again, I'd probably go with a 3rd coat or do this a little bit differently. But yeah, unfortunately, I was out of frame for most of the mold assembly, so you're not gonna see that, but all I did was clamp this piece on for this next part and pour in silicone. I wanted this little dingus end to be completely solid because, I didn't want any of the shell to get in there. So this is me pouring the silicone in, filling this part up. This is all I have of assembling the mold together after the dingus end cured. Since this part was round, it was kind of a pain in the ass to get the clamp onto this. I was just slipping off, so I decided to forego it. It seemed like it was clamped enough anyways with the top and the bottom.
I'll call that good enough.
Unfortunately, I was also out of frame for probably one of the most important parts of this, and that was molding the silicone, rotomolding the silicone. When you rotomold the silicone, basically I put this together, poured the silicone in a little butthole, and then spun it around like this, similar to what you'll see in the next part. When you pour that silicone in, it's going to bond the 2 halves of the silicone that I brushed in together to create one piece. I only did one shot of this, and honestly, the seam where they glue together isn't as strong as I'd like it to be. I should have done it in 2 parts, but I was feeling kind of lazy, and well, that laziness came through in the final piece. So yeah, if I were to do this again, I would do 2 coats of the silicone inside. I only did 1, but it still came out. So here I'm mixing up the Smoothcast 300 Quick. It is a 2-part epoxy. Basically, you mix the A and B together. You have 30 seconds before it turns from water, and like that, it turns rock hard. So I poured it in the hole and then spun it around because at this point, this is still hollow and there's nothing inside here but silicone, and there's really not much structure to it. So I poured that in and spun it around. This is called rotomolding. Spun it around really quick. Did about 4 layers of this just to build it up very slowly. because when you roll a mold, you really only get thin layers. And this is the exact same thing that I did for the silicone part. The smooth cast comes out white, and you can see here the shell that the smooth cast has created on top of the silicone. Silicone being the fleshy part, and then the white epoxy part being the shell, the structure that this ends up making. Now's the demolding. This part kind of sucked, and I kind of screwed myself ahead of time. When making the mold, I didn't include a draft angle. A draft angle is, if this is your mold and this is your part, draft angle lets you pull it out easier. If you have walls that are vertical, it sucks to pull out. So I didn't have a draft angle on any of these pieces. That was one. I definitely didn't use enough mold release. That was two. And then the third part, I totally screwed up. I should have removed the silicone before putting in the rigid part, because if you have a rigid on rigid mold, it sucks to remove. The biggest problem were the chumbles up here. So the chumbles, the balls of mold look like this. They're kind of captured like that. There's a top part of the mold. And then when I pour silicone in, it's easy to pull out. It's almost like pulling off a sock. No problem. But as soon as I cast the epoxy in, they were captured. So I had a rigid ball inside of a mold that didn't want to pull out. I don't know how I ended up getting that out, because it was captured in rigid on rigid. Might have been because it was still warm and deformed all coming out, but I ended up breaking the mold where the epoxy was, so I could easily put it back together. But yeah, that's kind of where I screwed up this top part. If I were to do it again, I would build up the silicone a little bit more, so I had some structure, pull it out of the mold, and then pour in the epoxy to give it that body.
You know what? That's not bad. Oh my god.
Yeah, overall, this was a really fun project to make. I think it came out great. It was one of my first, actually, I think it is my first movie prop, if you will, that I've made. It seems pretty accurate. Yeah, I'll leave links in the description below for all the tools that I used to make this and the parts that I used. I'll leave the links for the CAD for this and the mold if you want to make your own. Got a bunch of projects coming this way, so stay tuned, subscribe, and yes, I'll see you next time.